with my second HR boardroom. So today we're going to talk about leading change, but I'm going to focus it on the kind of people element of change. So we're not going to talk around change as a process, change as a function. We're not going to talk through particular change models. What I want to talk about today is the kind of psychology and the people element of change, and how either as a leader or an HR head or an HR leader or an individual line manager, how you can be more aware of the impact that change has on people's psychology. And I'm going to reference a couple of tools that you can use to support you in that process. So as Joe said, if you've got any questions, either pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end, or we'll do a Q&A at the end as well. So
Too much change isn't a good thing.
Sorry?
Too much change isn't a good thing.
Well, that depends, doesn't it?
Ask the climate.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, it's a constant, isn't it? We can't slow it down. Change is a constant. And whether some people love it, some people thrive on it. It's the nature of how the change is managed, I think, obviously has a big impact on people. But yeah, let me share my screen 1 second. There we go. So you can see, can you see my my PowerPoint slide now? Fabulous. Fabulous. So as Joe said, my name is Steve Brunt. So I'm a learning and development consultant, and I work, so I kind of specialize in kind of workplace relationships, I guess. I do a lot of work around leadership, management development, but also do a lot of stuff around team dynamics, team development, and working with teams to help them perform better, working with teams to help them communicate more effectively. But one of the topics that often comes up in my programs is something that organizations want to deal with or want to tackle is, how do we lead change? So, I guess the first question to kind of ask ourselves is, how do we feel about change? Because we can't stop it. We know it's a constant, particularly in our working environment, but things change all the time. So how people feel about change really depends on the context. If imagine you've been offered your dream job, for example, it's something that you've been working for your entire working life, but it requires you to relocate. You decide to accept that move. How does that feel? That's going to be a change. So you might be excited on one hand because of the opportunities of a new role, but actually there'll be some, potentially some pangs there of fear because of the potential of having to relocate to a new place, new family, relocate your family to new schools, all those kinds of things. So it is very contextual. That's a change where we have some element of control. So therefore, does it feel slightly different? It might do in certain circumstances. Imagine you're living in a rented house though, or rented property, and this may well have happened to you, and your landlord decides to suddenly sell that house. So you've got to move. How do you then feel? When a change is forced upon us in that context, often we could maybe have a slightly different reaction. Now, some people will feel excited by elements of that, and other people will kind of go into a bit of a spiral. So helping us to understand how we individually respond to change, and helping us understand how other people around us can respond to change can help to kind of manage others and ourselves through it. So, when you think about those things, it kind of helps us explore everyone's got varying attitude towards change. We can fear it, we can crave it, we can do both, depending on how we view that specific change that might be happening around us. A lot of our underlying attitude, values, and beliefs will often impact how we respond to change. And a lot of that will depend on our past experiences. If you've been through particularly traumatic, and can I focus this on a work context initially? But if we have gone through a particularly traumatic or challenging change program in our employment, then we may remember the bad stuff about that and hold that true to any time we face any future change. We also have to think about the value that we place on the outcome, the longer term outcome of the change that's being implemented. and also how much control we believe that we have, or how much control we don't have over that. So, and you're right, Rebecca's put in the chat, the first thing that people think is, how does this affect me? And you're absolutely right. I think people do tend to go there first. And yet organizations often think about that stuff last. So those responses to change, are very different. And these are some interesting stats. A couple of studies by fairly big organizations. How accurate they are, I don't know, but it makes the point that there are a huge amount of change programs and change initiatives that don't stick, that don't meet the goals that they set out to do. So what is it that makes the 30% successful? And upon that research, what McKinsey and both Gallup kind of looked at the research around what made the 30% successful, and there was a couple of common things. One, there was an improved initial buy-in to the change by employees within those organizations. So they did some work up front to improve that initial buy-in to the change. They then also recognized and managed human behavior patterns. So they started to consider the psychology of how we behave during change, and gave managers tools and techniques in order to help manage that human behavior. And then they created strategies for long-term success. They made sure that their people were equipped to be able to do the right thing longer term. And we know that change comes from lots of different directions. From a technology perspective, technology is transforming the way we work. Artificial intelligence seems to be the most current thing, doesn't it? How AI is growing, and people are using ChatGPT to write college and university assignments, and to write web content, write proposal documents, all sorts. So technology transforming the way that we work, driving new and improved products, reshaping how businesses work, and in some cases replacing human intervention. So technology is a big one. We've got the traditional reorganization. So this is the stuff that generally sits outside of our control. This is kind of mergers and acquisitions, growth, downsizing, re-strategizing, the restructuring of organizations, which is quite often what most people will face during their kind of working life, is some kind of reorganization, restructure. But of course, more recently, our whole way of working has been changing. So organizations are becoming globalized. We've got virtual project teams, we've got virtual teams kind of connected. A lot of that was sped up because of COVID. So the virtualized way of working the pace of that's been gathering for quite a long time, but the pandemic forced the pace even quicker. So people have had to adjust to working in a very different way. And actually now they're having to readjust to a slightly different way yet again. So where people may have been completely home based, organizations are looking at hybrid models. Organizations are trying to get people to come back into the workplaces. So there's more change for people to kind of manage on how they do that. And what was really interesting, I read a piece of research around our ways of working, and it talked about how communication through virtual means is actually outpacing the number of interactions taking place in a face-to-face or traditional environment, even when employees and colleagues are sitting around each other. People are still communicating more virtually than they are actually face-to-face. And I think that's just something that, again, the pandemic kind of sped up that process. But some organizations have been doing this for a long, long time. It's not necessarily new. But as I said at the top, we know that change is an absolute constant. It is inevitable. And sometimes we're the driver of those changes. Sometimes we're the ones who are making the choice to change a career, change a role, move house, change our hair, buy a new car, whatever it might be. Sometimes we're the driver, sometimes we're the subject. Or as Geraint Thomas, who is a very good English cyclist, he said in one of his interviews, sometimes you're the hammer and sometimes you're the nail. Sometimes you're doing the hitting, sometimes you're being hit. And it's the same with change. Sometimes we're driving it, sometimes we're the instigators. Often we're the subject. More often than not, we're the subject, particularly when we think about it from a working context. So we think about the kind of human psychology around change. We know it's disruptive. So resistance often arises as individuals because we're comfortable in the stuff that we know. Even if we deep down, logically, we might know the new world will be better in the long run, we're uncomfortable in the present of not knowing what's going to happen. So often resistance comes from wanting to maintain that status quo. Change requires new learning, new ways of doing things, new effort. And if the benefits of the new aren't communicated in an engaging way and people don't buy into it, then people will resist. There will be resistance to that change. But any kind of change is an experience. It affects us emotionally, it affects us physically, and it affects us how we think and behave. No two people experience change in the same way. We all go through it really differently. And it's important that we don't make assumptions based on how we might deal with a situation. Assume that everyone else will follow suit, will deal with it in the same way, because it is very different for everybody. What might seem minor to one person could be a major change for someone else. And this is really key, when we're thinking about how we lead people through change effectively, it's understanding those individual responses as much as we possibly can, and being able to flex our leadership style in how we help and support people through that. So, the way that we go through change will be impacted by things around our psychological preferences, the values, our value set, the history we've had, and how we've experienced change previously. And as I kind of alluded to, whether you're reacting to change or creating the change, your response will be different. So if we're the creators, we're in control, we're in the driver's seat. We've got decision-making power, we've got conscious, well thought through, we can physically think about how we can utilize our behavioral skills to creatively solve problems. It can be energizing, motivating, and generate commitment if it's an intentional change. If we're creating that change, we have a proactive choice. Yet often we're reacting, particularly in our working context. We don't like it necessarily when change is opposed upon us, but for most organizations, that's actually what happens. It may be sudden, it may be quite abrupt. It's likely to be disruptive, and it may cause more problems than it's trying to solve often. And not managed correctly, it can lead to demotivation, resistance, and resentment. So having that awareness of whether you're responding or creating or reacting to that change, you can create some kind of choice over how you respond. And I love this quote from Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, is that despite everything that he suffered, so if no one's read the book, so Viktor Frankl survived a number of concentration camps in the Second World War. And despite all he kind of went through, one of the things that he was that kind of really landed for him during that time was that he still had a choice over his attitude. So he had no choice about where he was, about what was happening to him and his friends and his family. And all of those freedoms were taken from him, but he still had that freedom of being able to choose one's own way, to make that choice your own. So that's it. In that space is our power to choose that response. So we have the power to choose our response to change when we have a level of awareness of how it impacts us and how it impacts the people around us. And this is an interesting one. Thanks for that, Steve. Yeah, and it's a really powerful book, actually. It's really, really powerful book. So I really would recommend it. It's an interesting read. The book's kind of split into two halves. The first half is really the story of his survival. And the second story is then all about his work. So he was a psychologist, and he actually created a type of therapy called logotherapy. So the second half of the book is all about how that his life's work, how he kind of brought that to life based on his experiences and how he survived the camp. So it's well worth a read. But when we think about change as leaders, as managers, often what we see is the stuff above the waterline. You know, we see stuff. We see how the impact of change, we see the impact of change in how people behave. Often the emotional context, which is this kind of stuff below the water, is hidden. You know, we don't necessarily, we might see someone's attitude in terms of their behavior, but their values might be quite personal, quite hidden. Certainly their beliefs might be quite deep rooted. So, you know, when we're leading people through change, we may not see some of the stuff that's under the waterline unless people choose to share something, or unless something pulls it to the surface. Now, what often happens is when somebody's values are challenged because a change is forced upon them, that stuff might then be forced above the waterline. So everyone keeps, you know, how much we keep hidden and how much we share is different for everybody, depending on how comfortable they are in the environment in which they're in. But the hidden stuff is all about the emotion. It's the stuff that we really care about. It's often the deep-rooted, innate motivators often that are hidden. And like I say, change can often pull those to the surface, and not always in a positive way. So again, as a leader, thinking about what are you actually seeing? You're seeing stuff. There's an awful lot of emotion around people that is hidden, and that emotional context is often hidden below the water. Now, you know, there's a school of thought that people don't like change, which actually we know is not necessarily true because of, you know, if you think of your own examples, I'm sure you can think of times where a change has happened to you and actually it's been really positive and you thrived and it motivated you, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's this, I think organizations have this thing that people are scared of change, and actually people aren't necessarily afraid of change. The main emotion that challenges change is fear. And resistance often arises because we fear our values, our needs, and our beliefs are under threat. So for many people, change often equals some form of loss. And we are afraid of losing stuff. You know, we do fear losing things. We don't like loss. And the loss can come from different areas. So, you know, we might lose, we might have a loss of significance. You know, we like a sense of structure. We like a sense of status. And that's not a status of hierarchy. It's not a status of being seen as really important. It's a status of knowing our position of where we are. We like to know where we stand. You know, people are generally comfortable in that. So that significance is important. We also like, you know, we also fear a loss of control. You know, we generally like being in command of our own competence, our own skill levels, our own knowledge. You know, we like knowing what it is that we do. You know, we like to be seen as competent in the roles that we do and who we are and what we know and how we can support other people. But also there's a fear of a loss of belonging. You know, we are tribal creatures. You know, if we go back thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, if you were not part of a tribe, if you were not part of a community, it probably meant certain death, because people work together in order to survive. People work together in order to effectively live. And the fact that we are here as human beings shows that we're a resilient species, but we're attracted to community. So when that community is under threat, that triggers a sense of loss, that fear of losing something. So that loss of belonging, that loss of connection, that loss of community. Now that could be coming from kind of working relationships and from all sorts of different areas. But when you think about, well, why do we respond to change the way that we do? And it's because we're hugely complex creatures. But if you start to delve into the kind of neuroscience and look at how our brain works, we're actually battling against a lot of legacy software. So we haven't evolved as much as we think we have. We have legacy systems within our brain functions that don't necessarily help us to manage and lead and respond to change effectively. Our safety system, so the part of the brain that keeps us safe, is out of date compared to our logic system. You know, our prefrontal cortex area is much more highly developed than the limbic part of the brain, which is the part that keeps us safe. So already we're kind of battling competing forces in terms of how our brain responds when we fear something. So if we have a look at our brain, the limbic area, which is that little red bottom, that includes the amygdala and all those. So that's that kind of guard dog area of your brain, right? It's the limbic area. It's that constantly sniffing the air for danger. It's always on the lookout, prowling, sniffing. You know, are you safe? Because its primary function, its only function really, is to keep you safe. It'll either move you away from danger, or it will move you towards something positive, reward. So that ancient part of the brain controls the fight, flight, or freeze response. And I'm really simplifying this, but you kind of get the point. It's there to protect us. It's not able, that limbic system doesn't differentiate between different types of danger, but it responds in the same way. So hundreds of years ago, a wild animal coming into your village, coming into your cave, legitimate response is fear, fight, or flight. Am I going to fight that animal? Are we going to run away? How am I going to respond? I'm going to keep you alive. Imagine now you get an email from your manager on 4:30, 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon saying, can we have a chat first thing Monday morning? And you receive that in your inbox just before you log off. It's likely your brain will have that same triggering response. It will initially go, what's all that about? Your limbic system doesn't differentiate between that threat. It's very different, but it still responds in exactly the same way. But also there's something in that limbic system that wants us, it's also responsible for making us feel part of something bigger than us. Limbic system wants you to be some part of something. Being alone meant certain death many, many years ago. So the limbic system wants connection, it seeks belonging, it's important. And it's always on, it's always constantly sniffing the air. And interestingly, that limbic area is actually 5 times stronger than the frontal cortex part of the brain. So it's likely it's always going to override the kind of logic center, if you like. And we have to learn strategies to kind of help us bring that back into line, which is a whole nother workshop altogether. But it's about recognizing those fear trigger responses. So again, when we fear loss, when we fear loss of significance, loss of belonging, our limbic system's going to be triggered. So if you think about the competing forces then, our brain is trying to process the logical stuff, finding some meaning, trying to survive. We've got the chimp part of our brain. And if you've read The Chimp Paradox by Steve Peters, you'll be familiar with this. This is the limbic part of your brain. This is that kind of chimp part. Those two are always kind of fighting. The human, the frontal part of the brain, and the chimp are kind of competing. But we've also got the parietal part of the brain, which is where we store information, data, memories, all those kinds of things. So all of these forces are kind of competing, trying to survive. So if you think about all that, people, when you think, well, that person isn't responding the way that I think they should around this change, well, it's often because they're responding from a place where the limbic system has taken over. They're not necessarily going to be thinking logically. All they're thinking about is potential loss of relationships, a loss of connection, a loss of status. Their limbic system, the chimp who just wants to survive, has taken over. People aren't going to respond in a logical way when they're in the thick of emotion, when they're in the thick of change, if we've not been able to surround people with the information, etc., they need in order to make sense of that. So as leaders, our role is to provide context for the change, and we also have to deal with the other challenges as well. Our role is to help other people adapt to that change. Does that make sense so far? Splendid. Like I say, I've probably really dumbed down that brain stuff. So if any of you are neuroscientists, I apologize if I have made your work seem insignificant, but I just wanted to put it in a context that was kind of really relatable. And when we think about, come on slides, you want to. When we think about how organizations approach change, they think that employees over time, there'll be a cumulative adaptation to the change. They just think it'll be a linear process, that everybody starts at the beginning of the change process. After a certain amount of time, 100% of the people are on board. They think everyone gets on board at some kind of perfect organized progression and everyone just is going to adopt. What's a more realistic view is this red line. You know, what often happens is you'll get a number of people who will start to engage, start to respond. But actually what you then get is a kind of dip, and then people will start to get on board much further down the line. So again, part of our role as managers and part of our role as from an HR perspective or as coaches is to try and help close this gap, try and flatten out this dot. But we still have this maybe unrealistic view that everyone will still be on board at some point, and that's not actually the case. You know, when we look at change through the lens of psychology, it can really help us navigate ourselves and other people through. Now, and again, when we think about change, there's loads and loads of different change models out there, and I'm sure you will have come across many of them. Change is external. So the change is something that happens outside to us. Change, it can often be sort of powerful and compelling, but it keeps happening. It's relentless, whether we like it or not. For a long time, we thought people journeyed through change was understood through the change curve. Kubler-Ross change curve model. It's a great model, but again, it is not a linear process. I think organizations have adopted that and just think everyone will move through that curve at the same speed and at the same time. If you tell them something, they don't take into consideration that people might move around that curve as well. And there is a way that we can use the change curve effectively through change, and I will kind of touch on that in a bit later. But you know, the change curve is a model that suggests that change event suddenly happens, and after which we all move through the same range of emotions at the same rate. And we know that's not true. It's not a linear process, it's contextual. And to help that, we can overlay with a model that I really like, that I think not many people may have come across, which is the transition model, which is around, actually, it's the difference between the two. So change is the external event or situation that takes place, the restructure, the new way of working, the merger, whatever it might be. Change happens generally quite quickly. Transition is that the inner process that we go through as we internalize and come to terms with the new situation. So it is an inner psychological process. So to help people transition from end to new beginning, we must help them navigate this kind of neutral zone. So to help people with that transition, we shouldn't be thinking of outcomes or the new beginning. We need to help people deal with the ending. We need to help people deal with what they've left behind. So that transition starts with an ending. We identify what we're losing. We learn how to manage those losses. You know, and you can apply this, and you can overlay this with the Kubler-Ross model, and it works really nicely because, you know, we're talking about, you know, the Kubler-Ross model was originally created around helping people understand how we dealt with diagnosis of terminal illness, or how we responded to grief when losing somebody we love. But individuals need to determine what's over, what's been left behind, and what are they going to keep. And some of that will include relationships, some of it will include process and worky stuff, some of it will be team members, it might be locations. But we need to allow time for people to come to terms with what they're losing. And if we're able to give our managers coaching skills, then we can help ask and have those conversations and facilitate those conversations to help people come to terms with that. The second step into that transition, though, comes once we've let the stuff go. It's this neutral zone. It's this in-between time where the old is gone, but the new isn't fully operational. And this is the critical bit of realignment and repatterning taking place. It's the heart of that transition process. It's the time between the old reality and sense of identity and the new one. People are creating new processes. They're learning what the new roles are going to be. They're still in a bit of flux. They may feel some state of confusion and distress. But this is the place where the seeds are planted for the new beginnings. And the new beginnings involve new understandings, maybe new values, new attitudes, new beliefs. And that beginning is marked by a release of new energy into a new direction. So it's when people come out of that change curve, where that acceptance phase, it's that potentially a fresh identity. So well-managed transitions allow people to establish new roles, with an understanding of what their purpose is, the part they play, and how they contribute and participate to the team. And as a result, they feel reinforced and renewed. So it's important that we kind of focus on that. So change will only really be truly successful if leaders and organizations address the transition that people experience during change, support people through that transition phase, rather than pushing forward. It's essential the changes to work as planned. It's going to be key to ensure that opportunities aren't missed for innovation, creating organizational resilience, etc. So being able to manage and coach and develop people through that transition, the transition model can be really powerful. And I think, like I say, part of that is ensuring leaders have the right skills in order to really support that. Now, that might be provided externally if the capability isn't in-house, but actually, if you provide managers with a core set of coaching skills, that can really be beneficial, because most people don't want you to solve their problems for them. They might just need some support or guide in the right direction. So when we look at come on, slides. So what I want to do now is kind of introduce an element of kind of personality and preference into this. So our personality, our preferences, and the responses to change are all kind of intrinsically linked. And our personalities are those natural and habitual ways we like to think, feel, and act most of the time. And it has a really big impact on our behavior, how we're motivated, how we like to communicate, how we make decisions. Now, I use insights discovery as a model to do that. Many of you may have come across insights discovery. Some of you might have come across Myers-Briggs, MBTI, or other kind of behavioral models. But if you've not come across insights before, it's a four-color model that helps us understand workplace behavior. It's grounded in the psychology of Carl Jung, just like MBTI is. And the theories apply to the what I'm going to talk through really applies to any kind of personality tool. But understanding how people approach and deal with change using a personality tool can really be beneficial. And we can do that through a pretty simple 5-step process around kind of how do we engage people, in change. Katie, yeah, it's great that you use both. I use both as well, Katie. So Katie in the chats used both insights and MBTI in her workplace. I'm accredited with both. I use insights more. And that's interesting. Yeah, people do really have a preference, which is what it's all about for MBTI or insights. And yeah, to me as an L&D professional, it doesn't matter which tool you really use. I like insights. I like MBTI. There are others. As long as the purpose in which you're using it for is clear, and the way that you're going to use it in terms of helping people through change or through a leadership program, as long as that's clear, then it doesn't really matter. They all start with self-awareness. And if any of you came to my last session where I talked about emotional intelligence, the building block for that is self-awareness. Without that, you can't kind of understand how you can flex and adapt your behavior. So we look at this, the insights change engagement model. First part of that is clarify. What's our intent? Our intention here is to raise awareness of the change. So by asking questions using the color energies, if your insight's familiar, or using the different preferences if you're MBTI familiar. So, when we think about those who might be an ESTJ, for example, in this context, we might be talking about those who lead with fiery red. What do they want to know about the end goal? What's the plan to get there? Think about your own individual preferences and the questions that you're asking, because your workforce, your colleagues will be asking the same sorts of questions. So by considering the context for each of these different preferences can help us engage people in a much more enigmatic way up front. So have we created a compelling vision for those people who have that dominant sunshine yellow preference or that strong extroverted feeling preference? Am I inspired? Am I involved? What's the impact going to be on me? How's it going to be impact other people? How am I feeling? So those who might be that more introverted feeling preference, how are they going to be impacted? What are they sorts of questions might they be thinking? They won't necessarily externalize them because of that more introverted nature. The same with those kind of dominant cool blue or those introverted thinkers. What do I understand about the rationale for this change? What's the why that's driving this process? So when we can think about what might be missing for each of those preference areas, whether you use the insights model or the Myers-Briggs model or another model, we can be clear then around what it is that we can effectively articulate and engage with our teams if we think about what we might be missing. The next step then is to think about communication. And actually, again, we can use the insights model to think about the structure of our communication. So how do we consider perspectives across all of our teams? Our teams are going to be a mixture of personality and preferences. We can't please everyone all the time, but considering the impact of change across different preferences can help minimize some of the issues that might crop up. So again, some people want to see really clear structure, plan, action plans, timelines, deadlines. Some people want to be brought along on the journey. They want to be compelled. They want that vision. Some people are going to be focused on impacts of people. How's that going to change day-to-day relationships? What are the driving forces around that change? So again, we can build our comm strategy thinking about the different preferences within our teams by kind of creating a balanced message that touches on the different types of personality preference. Providing introverts, if you're going to run drop-in sessions where there's going to be lots of people attending, those who have a more dominant introverted personality might not feel comfortable in coming to like a big open Q&A. So have you enabled something for them to be able to ask questions, but in a safe way where they don't necessarily want to put them out in front of other people? So whatever psychometric you might use, comms should be balanced across all the preferences: extrovert, introversion, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition. When we then think about, well, okay, how do we help people foster that acceptance? It's again self-awareness, understanding our personal responses to change. What are our strengths amongst that? What are the challenges? What are our potential blind spots? How do I, if I overplay my strengths, what might that look like? So if we have a look at, again, just taking the insights model here, if you have a look at some of the strengths that we might identify for, because with these models, with these tools, whether it's MBTI, whether it's insights, whether it's DISC, there's nothing in here that's like negative in terms of a lack of skill or ability. It's simply about workplace behavior. So every preference will bring strength. Fiery red brings that decisiveness, that drive, that punchiness to get going, that engaging people, that wanting to kind of get on with it. Sunshine yellow brings the storytelling. It seeks creativity. It involves other people. Earth green really focuses on the values. It does, it wants to make sure that there's no conflict, there's harmony, that people aren't left behind. Cool blue wants to get in amongst the detail and wants to understand the how and the why in the process. So every color energy brings a strength, but we know under pressure and we know under stress that often our strengths become our weakness when we overplay those. So it's being mindful of knowing what your trigger points might be that push you into that kind of weakness area. So fiery red can become a bit impatient if people aren't getting on board quickly enough, if they perceive that. Sunshine yellow might get too creative, too many ideas. Earth green, they prefer that slower pace. So they might kind of start to be a bit stubborn if they feel that it's moving too quickly. Cool blue might be overcautious and over rely on facts and figures and details. So it's important from our own context to understand our strengths and potential challenges, but also thinking about that of the people that we're helping through that change as well. Then we move into the implementation stage. Through a lot of the research and of common practices among experts in change, two key success factors have emerged as being really important navigating through change, and that's resilience and adaptability. So we know change causes stress, so our ability to remain resilient in the face of stress is important for ourselves, for our health, and for the health of our people around us. But that competency of being adaptable is what allows us to remain fluid in the face of that constant change and not be thrown off course. That is something that has become really, really valuable. And we know, when we look at people's performance in relation to the amount of stress or pressure that they feel, there's a sweet spot. There's a sweet spot between if there's not enough pressure, we're bored. If there's too much, we get into this distress, we get into panic. but there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle around this stretch zone where this eustress, which is called, literally translated to good stress. And everybody's sweet spot will be different. Everybody's tipping point will be different. So understanding your own is really valuable in understanding your responses to change, and knowing what will stress you out. And again, if you think about that from the color energies perspective, here's some things that might cause some stress factors for each of the 4 color energies. And again, this would apply to the same with any personality behavior model that you want to use. But again, it's about that awareness of like, so I lead with dominant earth green. So I know if I'm going through a relationship, if I'm going through a change program for my organization, some of those things are going to stress me out. Some of those things are going to trigger me to dig my heels in, and the bad day behavior will come out. Being mindful of that, I know what I need to do to alleviate some of that stress. So once you know those possible causes, you can then look at those alleviating factors. And again, that's something for another session, just due to time. But again, thinking about those possible causes for your own self, and also the people that you're leading through. Now, I wanted to very briefly kind of look at the change curve, but I want to talk about it, and I'm conscious of time, but I felt this was important. So most of you will have seen the change curve at some point or another, and the different stages and how people move through it. As change leaders, as managers, change leaders, HR professionals, L&D professionals, whatever your role might be, how do you help other people through this then? The first 2 stages is about using these things in better proportion than this thing. People don't want you to solve their problems. The worst thing that you can do when someone is in that denial or anger phase is try and solve the problem for them. Don't jump in and fix it. Don't offer solution. Don't even agree. Just listen. They will move through from stage 2 to 3 in their own time if you're there to support with open-ended coaching style questions. What are you feeling at the moment? What the immediate questions might you have? What's causing you the biggest worry at the moment? Open questions, listen to those responses. Really listen. Don't listen thinking about the next question that you're going to ask. Listen to the response that you're getting from that person. When they get into that doubt phase, what they really need then is support. This is that kind of I'm confused. You can spot it, because you might hear things around, what am I supposed to do in my work now? Perhaps I should look elsewhere for a job, or I'm not sure about what's going on here. So the idea here is start to direct people, start to give a bit of support, start to provide a little bit of direction, and thinking about, again, what challenges they might be facing in their kind of individual role. So again, providing a little bit more structure here, still asking those open-ended questions. What do you want to be different in 6 months' time? What do you see the opportunities that might be here? What's within your control at the moment? What support do you need from me in order to kind of help through here? Then as you start to climb through the acceptance and integration phase, you can then start to have much more kind of adult to adult conversations. This is where you can start to set stretching objectives. When people are on board, you can really challenge them, get them on board, and creatively problem solve with them, get them involved in the process of moving forward. So, you can use coaching skills. Steve, thank you. Apologies for the slight late run-in. You'll get slides recording afterwards. So any questions, reach out to me via LinkedIn or whatever when you see my contact details on the slide. So thanks for attending. But yeah, so coaching is a really powerful tool. So it can help people move through the transition and those change curves. So finally, when we get to the final step, then is that sustaining. How do we sustain that change? Because we know from the stats earlier that a lot of change doesn't stick. So now's not a time to sit back with tea and medals. Now's a time to support people, maintain the engagement that you've built through the process. How have things gone? Can you conduct an engagement survey to understand what could be better? Involve your people, keep involving your people in transitioning into that new environment. If things didn't work, what are you going to address? What are you going to commit to do things differently next time? And kind of really wrapping it up again with a slight insights twist is I really like this infographic that they provided here around the 4 Ps of effectively leading change. And if you look at the Ps, they are linked to the color energy. So purpose, what's the why? Those with a cool blue or that dominant thinking preference will want to know why. Build the compelling picture, help people visualize the outcome, tell the story, engage, create, sunshine yellow energy, extroverted feeling energy. Focus on the people. What's the impact going to be on the people? Earth green, introverted feeling energy. How is this change going to impact people at different stages? And what are you going to put in place to support people through that? And then lastly is the plan. How are you going to get there? Communicate actions, set deadlines, fiery red, extroverted thinking. How are you going to help people along the plan and create that kind of drive to get to the new world? So I just want to kind of wrap up with some top tips, really just a kind of reminder. So change is personal, right? You and I aren't going to go through the same thing in the same way. Understanding our psychological needs, your own psychological needs and the needs of others, it's really, really powerful. Using a tool like Insights Discovery or MBTI or any other kind of valid psychometric can really help in that. Don't begin with the change. Think about the context. Think about your leadership approach. Think about the people. Think about how you're going to help people transition. Help people deal with the endings. Support people through that process. Find the champions, leverage their support, and engage buy-in and sustain momentum. If you've got people who are committed and they're enthusiastic, so they're low resistance, but they're highly respected, maybe they've got a lot of influence, utilize those people, get them on board, get them to become your champions. If you can, provide your leaders with basic coaching skills. They don't need to become qualified coaches, but just having a toolkit, a suite of coaching style questions can be really valuable to help people through that change curve. And provide different outlets for people's questions and concerns. Like I said, and it's someone who's got a dominant introverted preference might not feel comfortable in a public Q&A. So think about how you're going to allow different people, different personality types, access to information and questions, etc. That's a lot of information I've thrown at you, and I realize the time has kind of ticked away. I really hope that there's something you've taken away from there.
Steve, one thing I've noticed in many organisations is that they get part way through change and then it all seems to flop, and what they set out as the benefits and reasons for change seem to dissipate. And I know you said it's important to embed the change, but how do you keep that sustained level of performance and effort when even the leadership have been losing interest?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And I think it has to go back for that leadership team. If they're role modeling the behavior where they've lost interest, there's no way you can expect the rest of the organization to maintain the level of enthusiasm and be on board if they're seeing the behaviors from their leaders that aren't echoing. So I think it is about that constant review of where are we, and if the enthusiasm has dropped or the impetus has gone, then I guess you have to ask the question: is what we're doing still relevant? Why has it? What's changed? What have we lost? How can we get this back? But actually, are we doing the right thing still? Because if it's petered off and people don't seem to be bothered, or we're not interested in what the result might be, then are we changing for change's sake? And is it still relevant that we carry on this path? And if it is, great. But then how do we reinvigorate the interest? And I think asking the questions around, well, what is it that why has the interest been lost? Have we not been communicating in a way that's meeting the needs of the workforce? Are we giving too much detail? Are we not giving enough? Is it moving too slowly? Is it moving too quickly? So I guess it's asking ourselves as leaders those sorts of questions. But I would argue, I'd ask, well, if it's happened, then is it still relevant? do we still need to go down this route?
And I think that's a very good call. And the reason I'm asking the question is because some organisations seem to go from one lot of change to another and never really embed what they've set out to do. And I think that it creates, possibly at the worst end, distrust, but people just seem to drag their feet going, oh, here we are with another initiative. Yeah.
It causes a change fatigue, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
And I think, but again, it's been, I think for the initiators of that change, it's been really clear on what the benefits are going to be longer term. Is it something that is going to produce real benefit to us, whether that be financial or increased performance or whatever it might be, and not lose sight of that overall outcome. And it feels like that perhaps that's what happens sometimes, is we forget about the real outcome and we just continue blindly, and we've lost sight of that. And or leadership changes, and actually, somebody then well, actually, I don't agree with that, but we've kind of got this far, so we may as well push on. And I guess you have to, I wonder if it's worth asking the brave question: do we pull the plug and just accept that we've put a lot of time and effort into this, but it's not working? Do we be brave and go, let's can it? Or do we push on and hope that it might achieve something for us in the long run? But if that's the case, you need to make sure that the impetus is there, and the resources and the structure, the communication channels, all those things need to be in place for it to hit. But this is why 70% of change programs don't land or don't kind of create lasting change, is because this stuff keeps happening.
Yeah, and that really struck a chord.
Yeah, and it still astounds me. Yeah. So there's some interesting questions for leaders to kind of ask themselves, I think.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And I've enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, not so much a question, but I did want to say I really enjoyed the session. I've taken a lot from it, and hopefully the people that were a bit disruptive haven't put anybody else off, but I'll definitely come back to future sessions. So thank you so much. It's been quite easy to understand.
Thanks, Laura.
Fabulous. That's really nice feedback. Thank you. And I think, the sessions, this is only my second one for Joe, and I make them really relatable, because that's really important. So I make, hopefully there's things that you can take away. And so Joe will send you a copy of the slides. So there'll be all the reminders and stuff in there anyway, because I know I've packed a lot in today. But my contact details are there. So if there's any questions after the session, you want to know more about insights and how you can use it, because I use it in lots of different ways. It's a great tool to understand change, but team development, leadership programs, it really, really is valuable. So if you want to know more about insights, then again, feel free to reach out. I do genuinely mean that.
Thank you. Yeah, we're doing insights through our organisation, and there's a few teams that have got that in place already, and I hadn't really considered tapping into that as part of change, so I certainly will. Thank you. Yeah,
you're welcome. I mean, I did a session last week for a client, and we talked about, so I did a lot more around the stress responses. Yeah. So if your organisation, if you've got insights practitioners, they can access quite a lot of material through insights, and there's a whole load of stuff there around stress triggers and mitigating stress responses. There's stuff in there. There's a load more stuff around change in there. So yeah, that's why I like it. It's a really easy tool to use, and in lots of different ways.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll just close the session if that's okay with you, Steve.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Joe.
So we'll send out some correspondence to everyone that signed up for the event, and I'll put a post on LinkedIn. So if you would like a copy of the slides and or the recording, then please put a comment against the LinkedIn post. Next week, we've got two events. So on Tuesday at 12:30, it's self-compassion, the unrecognised leadership skill. And on Thursday at 12:30, it's dignity at work. A link to sign up for those events will be contained in the email. We're also going to send out a quick survey to everyone for your feedback on the event. So if you've got a couple of minutes to complete it, then it would be appreciated. Also as well, we've got accountancy recruit, an FD recruit, and exec recruit within the group if anyone is recruiting. Otherwise, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to Stephen for your time in putting the event together. There's a lot of obviously work gone into that, so I'd just like to say thanks very much, and also to everyone for tuning in. Hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks again, Joe. Thanks, everybody.